Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Tria Andrews. I'm a PhD candidate in the Ethnic Studies Department, and I want to thank the Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues and UC Berkeley's Native American Studies program for sponsoring this event. There were some key individuals that really helped put this together, and those are Joseph Myers, Christine Trost, Yuri Hobart, and Beth Piatot in Ethnic Studies, the Ethnic Studies Department. And this event is also sponsored by the Native American Studies program. So Lakota communities have historically and contemporarily been implicated in American policies regarding education and incarceration. For Native American children in the U.S., schooling has been inextricably tied to the prison. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, his philosophy for assimilating Native American children was informed by his experiences disciplining Native prisoners at Fort Marion, Florida, founded Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was the first off-reservation boarding school in 1879. The children and grandchildren of Sintagleshka Spotted Tail, a famed Lakota leader from the Rosebud Reservation, were some of the first students to attend Carlisle. The 1881 murder of Sintagleshka led to the 1885 Major Crimes Act, still in effect today, which overrode tribal sovereignty and restorative justice practices by placing 7 crimes under U.S. jurisdiction. In the present day, Wble Won Ti, or Eagle Life Center, the tribally run juvenile hall on the Rosebud Reservation, which was founded in 2005, has received national attention in U.S. policy discussions, such as the July 2015 oversight hearing on juvenile justice in Indian country, challenges and promising strategies, and the media, including the Washington Post and most recently Indian Country Today. Boarding schools, often associated with the trauma that some Native American youth endured, have historically portrayed Native practices as deviant to justify the project of assimilation. Wble Won Ti seeks to maneuver against these human rights violations committed by assimilative and punitive institutions through a commitment to educating and rehabilitating Lakota youth through culturally relevant programming. Today it is my pleasure to introduce Miskoo Petite, who I first met in 2011 when I began conducting research on the Rosebud Reservation. For the past 8 years, he has served as the facility administrator for the Rosebud Sioux Tribe Corrections Services Juvenile Detention Program. He has played an integral role in the development of innovative cultural-based programs and services to the youth detained in the Juvenile Detention Center. Given that Native youth are disproportionately imprisoned and subjected to violence in state and federal institutions at alarming rates while they are incarcerated, the work that Wble Won Ti undertakes with Mr. Petite's leadership is extremely important. Mr. Petite is an enrolled member of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska and an honorably discharged veteran of the U.S. Navy. He is a resident of Oak Creek community on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which is home to the Sicangu Lakota Oyate, or the Burnt Thigh Nation. He has a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Sintagleshka University and a master's degree in criminal justice management from National American University. He has served as the Rosebud Indian Health Services as a security officer and security director for over 12 years. He also serves as an adjunct professor at Sintagleshka University, where he teaches Introduction to Criminal Justice and courses on psychology and juvenile justice. After Mr. Petite speaks with us, we will have some time for Q&A, about 20 minutes. Please give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Haumatakiapi, Leon Petiki, Shante Washte Nape Chiuzapalo. Where's the interpreter? I just said greetings, my relatives. I shake your hand with good feelings in my heart. So that's a pretty standard formal introduction in our community and amongst our people. Thank you, Tria, for the introduction as well. I've been fortunate and blessed to be a part of this institution that I'll be sharing information with you about. First of all, I just kind of want to tell you guys where I'm from, because I've been here just 24 hours and I'm on a whole nother planet. So I'm from way over here in Rosebud, South Dakota, which is located in the south central portion of the state. The square area represents Todd County, which is probably one of the top 10 poorest counties in the nation. The adjacent area over here is called Pine Ridge, and that too is also afflicted with a lot of conditions of poverty. But if you look a little closer at the slide here, this yellow area represents the boundaries of the 1868 treaty. And if you was to look at the boundaries of the Lakota tribes, it might even be a little bigger than that. And at one time, even up into Wisconsin and down as far as North Carolina. The Lakota people were a nomadic tribe. They moved a lot in the Great Plains, sustained themselves with the Buffalo Nation. And that's one thing about our culture, is that we look at everything as a relative. So when I introduced myself in Lakota, I said, good afternoon, my relatives. And so we look at ourselves as being a part of the whole and being related to everything. Currently, as far as tribal enrollment, there's 24,217 members. The tribe consists of a large land base for the amount of people. The 24,000, there's a lot of people that aren't living on the reservation. They say that, some of the statistics with the Bureau of Indian Affairs state that there's a labor force of 16,177 people. We've experienced like high rates of unemployment, so there's very little industry or economic development happening, so there's not very many jobs in our community. So it's about 80% around there. I'm going to run through some federal policies that Tria had touched on, but just to let you know that the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the federal legislative, or the federal body that is there to oversee Native American affairs, and in particular our land and the laws that we create. And it took it's taken a long time to get where we are today, but one thing that's pretty significant is that that first department was created under the Department of War. And today they're in the Department of Interior, but at, the beginning phase, there's been people who have said, and with a lot of truth, that the reservation systems in the United States are more or less prisoner of war camps. So it's interesting to me, because as an administrator for a juvenile detention center, it's like we're in a jail, operating a jail inside of a community that is a jail. Is one way of looking at it. Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Trail of Tears. There's been several tribes who were moved, most commonly to areas with lack of agriculture, lack of just land that wasn't desirable. Basically the land that didn't have the gold on it and that kind of thing, so that's how the reservations were pretty much created, was Native people were moved to certain parts of the country, and there was an effort to try to assimilate Native American people, because our culture was so much different from the culture of pioneer, and one way to do that was the boarding schools, and I think the first one that was created, Mr. Pratt, I think he was quoted as saying, to save the man, you have to kill the Indian. And so there was a lot of policies inside boarding schools. The first thing that was done was, they were run kind of paramilitary. They cut young people's hairs. They washed their mouths out with soap if they spoke their language. There was just an intense punitive system, and it took a lot of native children far away from home, and tried to change them, and actually successfully did so for several people. That began in the 1860s. It still carries on today, actually. However, a lot of the Native American boarding schools have since adopted policies that try to restore language and culture and teach young people about who they are. So there's a long history of boarding schools. It affects each and every Native American person. Myself, I'm very aware of the boarding schools because I was raised in a home, where I guess it's kind of different from what's happening today with raising children. But I was spanked a lot, and I don't know anybody else in here that might have experienced that. But it took me probably 10 years to realize that, my parent that was spanking me was the one that was in boarding school, because she'd explained often the terrible conditions of the boarding school atmosphere, and some of the things they used to do in boarding school. I think more or less the process of boarding schools made her tough, but also like disciplinary, more focused on disciplinary. So that's my little story of how boarding schools affected me personally. But we had at one time been at war with the United States government, because we were living the way we wanted to live, and it was different from what the settlers, the values were different, and the values, I guess the clashing of cultures. In our culture, we shared everything. We didn't have to steal from one another. There was very little crime. We didn't have to lock things up. We looked out for one another. We had to in order to survive. And if you ever visited South Dakota, it's like you get the best of every single season. So it's going to get really, really cold in the winter and really, really hot in the summer. So it's not paradise like California. You guys are lucky. But in order to survive out there, the Lakota tribe was nomadic, had to move a lot, had to be very organized, and had to work together. And the dominant society, or the settlers, are they came in and have a different idea of, like, everyone's going to get a little section of land, and they're gonna farm it, they're gonna own it. There's this idea of owning something, owning land. We didn't have that idea. We had the idea that we were a part of the land, but we didn't own it. And so the monetary system, we did trade with other tribes and things like that to survive. But I think one thing that sticks out to me as far as our culture is we're very generous people, and we're also very, the people who were looked at as leaders in our culture were the ones who gave the most. And so they would be the people who were actually, they were the poorest people probably. They looked out for everybody and took care of everybody, and that's how a leader was determined in our tribe. Like today, Donald Trump might be our leader, right? Because he's one of the richest guys in America. So it's counterculture, and that's basically what we've been dealing with as a tribal nation. Major Crimes Act, of course, we signed these treaties, and we were given that large yellow land base, but gold was discovered in the Black Hills, where they had put the Mount Rushmore faces of the presidents. And that land there in the Black Hills is, we have origin stories. That's where the Lakota people came from. There's caves under the Black Hills where we have, stories, origin stories of that's where we came from, those caves underneath the Black Hills, and followed the buffalo out of those caves. And that's an area that we camped in the wintertime. It protected us from the weather. It's an area, but it's also an area where they found gold. And so the gold rush happened, and just the erosion of land, I guess, after that to what we have today. I don't know how many billions of dollars of gold was taken from the Black Hills, but if you were to look at, like, in the early 80s, there was actually a settlement from a Supreme Court case which gave Lakota tribes, like, pennies to the dollar, I think, and the Lakota tribes had said, no, we're not going to accept that. And so our stance on the Black Hills is that they're not for sale. So if you look at the Allotment Act, that was an effort, or Major Crimes Act is pretty important, because in our community, if we do something very, very criminal, we used to use, like, restorative justice, and we used to try to keep the peace because we had to be united. But under the Major Crimes Act, if you do something to a higher level of crime, in this particular case, Ex parte Crow Dog, he killed Spotted Tail, and the tribe resolved it the way that they always had. And the federal government said that ain't right, because it didn't involve any incarceration, and the federal government thought that wasn't enough punishment. So it took about 4 years before they passed or 3 years before they passed the Major Crimes Act, but that was in response to the Crow Dog legal process. Then the Allotment Act was a process of trying to divide the land up into parcels and give each Native American person a section of land to own and farm and ranch, and it was things that were kind of foreign to us, those concepts, and there wasn't a lot of success with Native Americans that were given probably just enough resources to get started, but it was just a foreign concept to us. But it also led to settlement of areas of land that were not taken by Native American people, and they were sold pretty cheap. Like, there's some posters that says, like, Native American land for sale. You can find them online, and it tells you how much it is, and there was, like, land rushes, and people were buying land very cheaply. The Indian Citizenship Act was in 1924, so that's when we were officially recognized as citizens of the United States of America. One particular note about that is we have more people in the United States military. We represent, per capita, we have more people represented in the United States military, and reasoning behind that is a lot of our tribal nations, we had warrior societies, and we took care of and protected our people. That was our responsibility, kind of like police officers. But we had to hunt and gather and provide. So protecting and providing was natural to us. So there's many Native Americans who are in the military, and another reason for that too is a lot of reservation communities are poverty stricken, so there's really nothing to do beyond high school other than to join the military. Not a lot of ability for Native American people to go to college, or it's not something that's natural to our communities. But yeah, we became Native American citizens in 1924. In 1934, there was the Indian Reorganization Act, and that created tribal governments. And those tribal governments are operating today as sovereign nations. So we have the ability to create our own laws, to create our own constitutions, and within our boundaries. But it kind of all falls under the guidance of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which still kind of has this mentality of being more of a parental type role, or a kind of a role of red tape, government red tape, kind of eliminating progress sometimes. So there's some of that history there with those two entities. The termination era, between 1953 and 1968, there was this program called the Relocation Program, and it was operated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And if you were living in a reservation community, you could fill out some paperwork, and they'd pay like your first month rent, and they'd try to help you find a job in cities like Los Angeles and Denver and Minneapolis, Cleveland. There might have been like a dozen different cities that the federal government had funding for, to try to get Native American people assimilated into America, or relocated. It was kind of set up more as an opportunity type thing, since there's so much poverty in our communities. So keep in mind that everything that's happened, there's good and bad with all of it, and the intentions. I read something that the boarding school kind of person who invented it, that was all kind of invented with good intentions too, but it just didn't work out that way, I don't think, or maybe it did. The sterilization program was run by the Indian Health Services, and that went as early as or as late as 1972. There were many women who gave birth at the Indian Health Services, and when we signed treaties with the federal government, we had signed treaties, and we wanted health and safety and education, and so a lot of the resources that come to us from the federal government are through federal programs, and Indian Health Service is one of them. But there were many women who were sterilized without them being informed about it, just sterilized, unable to have any more children. So it's kind of like a genocidal act against our people. After like the civil rights movement, and a lot of during that period of time there in the late 60s, with what was happening throughout the country, one thing that my parents were a part of was the American Indian movement, and they were surrounded by the federal, the FBI and the military, the National Guard. They were surrounded for about 3 months under heavy gunfire, and the American Indian movement was trying to promote change or bring attention to the problems that were happening in our communities. I guess they might have taken notes from what Martin Luther King started, and maybe the Black Panthers, and kind of came up with their own process for trying to implement change, or bring attention to it. And that was in 1973. in Wounded Knee. And what's pretty interesting is I was almost born there, surrounded by federal governments that were shooting at our people. My mother was there, pregnant, and she had complications, so they let her out, and I was born in the hospital nearby there. But that incident made national news, and it did bring a lot of attention to our situation. I guess we were kind of out of sight and out of mind, I guess. And they came out with this Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975, and that led to kind of the termination era, the end of the termination era, but it also empowered more, it empowered the tribal governments more to take on responsibility for federal programs. So the program that I work for is funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but it's operated by the tribe. So it's operated under a contract. It's called a Public Law 93-638 contract, but it all has to do with this Indian Self-Determination Act. So if it wasn't for this act, the Bureau of Indian Affairs would be operating the facility that I operate, and things would probably be a little different. Also, just one thing I think is very important to know, that there was a process of to save the man, you got to kill the Indian. So our religion, our way of life, and the ceremonies that were important to us were outlawed for a long period of time, and they were done underground. And for the most part, they survived. In 1978, we had the Indian Religious Freedom Act. So we just recently had received the right to practice our religion. As far as current issues in Native community justice systems, just recently there was the Tribal Law and Order Act, and that act actually gives tribes the ability to take back some of its responsibilities as far as crime goes, because the Major Crimes Act actually took a lot of that away. So the tribal justice systems primarily deal with like misdemeanors, kind of I guess mid-level crime, but not like high-level crime. But and then there was the Violence Against Women's Act, and that act of Congress. Like if you're a non-native and you're living on a reservation and you beat a Native American woman up, there's really almost literally nothing that could be done to you about it. The tribal police force only has jurisdiction over tribal members. So unfortunately, because of that, Native American reservations have some criminal element from outside of our reservation living on it too. People that are running from the law. Just recently, they had found and uncovered that the Mexican cartels were using the reservations to transport and distribute methamphetamine. So they're actually kind of reservations, because of the sovereignty, is kind of like a safe haven for people. And there was a lot of Native women who were getting beat by non-natives, and they would go unprosecuted, and many Native women were actually killed because of it, and nothing happened to the abuser. So now tribes have that ability to take control and actually prosecute somebody who commits crimes against our women. But those two pieces of federal legislation require the tribes to also jump through a lot of hoops and create their own legislation and strengthen their own systems in order to do that. So many of us aren't quite there yet. But why aren't we there yet? Is tribal politics. We have an IRA government. It's the Indian Reorganization Act government, and so every 2 to 3 years there's elections, and it's more or less based on popularity. It does support the emergence of leaders and leadership, but oftentimes with scarce resources, you got nepotism, and you got different negative things happening within the community because you got a lot of people who need things, a lot of poverty around, so a lot of negative things can happen too, and it could happen under tribal politics. Loss of language and culture. 15% of our the average. They say 15% of our people still speak the language, and most of them are like 60 years old on average. So there's a quickening and daily loss of language and culture. In our community, if I was to go in a classroom this size with this many people in it and ask, how many of you have a relative that committed suicide, everyone would probably raise their hand. I mean, suicide's a huge problem that we're dealing with in our community right now. High rates of teen pregnancy, high dropout rates, lack of economic development. Meth is kind of the new thing in Native communities. It's accessible, it's cheaper, it produces a longer high, and like I was saying, that they found the business plan on the internet that the Mexican mafia more or less said that this is how we're going to move it around, and so it's kind of more or less probably stored on reservations are transferred through there because there's a lack of jurisdiction, like state jurisdiction. We don't, and then the tribal jurisdiction is usually underfunded, so there's not enough police officers to actually combat the crime that's in our communities. If you look at different areas of the country, there's some articles that state like in an area of the state of Rhode Island, you have maybe 6 cops for every 100,000 people, but on the reservation, we might have like 1, and yet it's a poverty-stricken community with more problems, but we only have 1 police officer, and they might drive an hour this way to deal with a domestic violence dispute, and then they get called another hour this way. So it's like they're never getting to the crime, never able to get enough evidence. So a lot of things go unprosecuted. So our communities aren't safe, and we got a lot of young children who are affected by alcoholism in the womb, and so they say on average it could be up to 15 to 25% of people who have been affected by that, and fetal alcohol syndrome. It damages people for life. In our justice system, I know that there's been several occasions where the judge would sentence a woman to jail just so that she won't drink while she's pregnant. And so we deal with those issues every day. The Indian Child Welfare Act was an act of Congress that provided. There's a lot of Native children because they're in poverty-stricken communities, or because their lack of familial relationships or support systems. Because the boarding schools kind of what they did was they kind of made a lot of our people forget about how to have a family, how to be a family, and because when you were 5 years old, you were sent to boarding school, and you didn't see your family until maybe the summer, or maybe very briefly throughout the year as you were growing up. And so the lack of family or interconnectedness with family was greatly impacted. So there's like a lot of people that don't understand parenting. You know, you got teen pregnancies. A lot of people having babies when they're too young. So there's a lot of Native American children who are adopted to non-Native families. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act was set up to try to prevent that, but it still happens because there's not a lot of Native families that are able to care for a child. So every effort is made to try to keep the Indian child with Indian families, but most often it doesn't happen. Homelessness, there's, you know, a huge problem with housing in Native communities. They're not being built fast enough for people to live in, and then people can't afford homes. So you know, a lot of these houses are made shabbily and not I mean, just kind of put together as cheap as possible and as quickly as possible, and they don't last that long, and people can't even pay for them because they don't have no jobs. So, and then recently we've seen within the past 15 to 20 years Native gangs emerging in our communities, and a lot of this ties back to the Major Crimes Act, because when somebody in our community commits a major crime, they're sent hundreds of miles away from our reservation community, and they're usually kept there for anywhere from 2 to 10 to 20 years. But they're exposed to the federal systems, and in the federal systems, you have to do a lot of crime to get into the federal system. Usually if you do a crime, you end up in like a state or a county jail, right? But if you had to be like really, really do a lot of crime to end up in a federal prison. And so you got people, young men from our community who might have done a crime, but I'm not saying that they're completely innocent, because you know, but a lot of it has to do with like substance abuse. And just lack of hope, lack of promise for the future, and so they end up doing something dumb and maybe drinking and doing something stupid, and they'll end up in federal prison with hardcore criminals. But they'll learn to be better criminals, and then they'll come back to our community eventually. And that's where we've seen an increase of Native gangs, because they were exposed to it in the federal prisons. I have put together like a lot of different statistics, which Tria will share these slides with you. They're pretty similar to everything that I've just been talking about, but you know, just a lot of horrible statistics that surround our community, our Native communities, anyways. Regarding mortality, poverty and disease, unemployment, drugs and alcohol, incarceration, housing, our culture, loss of culture. So the thing that really sticks out to me as being the administrator of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe Juvenile Detention Center, operated by the Rosebud Sioux Tribe, is historical trauma. And I've learned a lot about this, just from different educated people in our communities, in our Native communities, who have taught me a lot about all this. As a matter of fact, before I started working for this facility, I had never heard of the term historical trauma. But in the process of learning from people, I come to find out that it exists, and I've talked to our young people, in our center about it, and they're like, they don't believe it. Like, no, that don't have nothing to do with me. It's not a part of my life. Like, what happened to us over 500 years isn't why I'm in juvenile detention center. So it's kind of like a new concept, but I mean, it's kind of like a concept that not a lot of people really know about or really understand or believe in. But if you look at our history and where we're at today and why things are the way they are, then definitely it's got something to do with just cumulative emotional, psychological wounding. And so that's what we're dealing with and working to try to defeat within our program at the Wble Won Ti. And this facility was built 10 years ago. It was developed by leadership from within our community. I remember when they had first talked about this in the newspaper, in the local newspaper, there was a lot of people that were totally against it. They were like, we don't want to lock our kids up, and rightfully so, and there was also a lot of people that said, why don't they build a boys and girls club or a rec center for people to do something? And those are good questions. And so the people who came together to create this facility, I guess to help design it, the tribal leaderships, they use that negativity to help shape it into something positive. And so we have a very nice facility. We have a excellent mission statement here, and I guess basically we're trying to reverse everything that's been happening to our community, and try to teach our young people more about who they are, what our values are, because if they know that, there won't be any more crime, there won't be any more problems, because we look at kinship and being related, like I said, as being very important. And so we wouldn't hit women, we wouldn't beat each other, there wouldn't be any more crime, and that would be a great thing to get back to. We had the construction process was back in 2003 and 2004, and then the facility was opened in 2005. And this facility is pretty unique as far as juvenile detention centers are concerned. 70% of the space is designed for delivery of programs. And in typical juvenile detention centers, that space is usually like 30%. So I've toured some juvenile detention centers, and they'll be like, oh, and then here's the library, and it's like a broom closet full of books, And so we're fortunate that this was shaped the way it is. It also has a lot of different like therapeutic type environments, round spaces. It lets a lot of light in from the exterior of the facility. It really was designed to help us do what we need to do. It made it a lot easier for us to do it. So we have 36 beds. We can classify based on the charges and the age, and if they have any behavioral problems or anything like that. So it's been operating 10 years. We have a day report school, which is like an intermediate sanction. So if when a juvenile is released from detention, they spend even more time kind of affiliated with our program to get more programming and to eventually graduate or get back out into the community and have better success. It costed $9.2 million. It costs about $1.4 million a year to operate. So with very little economic development, one other way to look at it is we employ 32 people. So that's 32 people that are here working under that mission statement with a code of conduct to try to influence positive change and to get culture to the forefront, and we bring that with them each and every day to our young people. So there's 32 people that aren't committing crime, 32 people that are doing what they can to try to make our communities safe. We just recently had a grant from the Department of Justice, and we were able to build a greenhouse, and it's a geodesic growing dome. And so it allows us to do gardening projects throughout the year, or at least longer than what gardening in South Dakota is only like 6 months. So this allows us to do it like 9 months out of the year. So it expands our growing season. So as far as tribal controlled justice systems go, we're trying to put more emphasis on restorative justice and making the community whole again, trying to make it right for the victim, restore peace and harmony. The term Lakota is the Lakota people. The term breaks down to La as being a dear, like something that's cherished or something that's dear. And then Kota is like friend, so it's like Lakota means like people that are friends, or people that are together and connected. The Lakota Nation is actually there's 7 bands within the Lakota Nation, and those bands were spread throughout the whole Midwest. But there's also the Nakota Nation, which they speak with the N dialect, and then there's the Dakota Nation. So there's 3 nations that speak the same language, but just with different dialects, and the Lakota Nation. So there's a lot out there that we need to learn about. We try to teach culture to our staff even as much as possible. I've learned a lot just by working at our facility about our culture, and there's fortunately a lot of elders in our community and a lot of good people in our community who come in and try to help us do that. There's a lot of people who come into those classrooms and different spaces to try to help make a difference and help these young people out. Like I said, our practice of our ceremonies at one time were considered against the law, and people had gotten in trouble or went to jail for practicing them. We at our facility were able to hold sweat lodges, our Wble ceremonies with medicine men who come in from the community, and those are some very powerful ceremonies. I've known people who have defeated cancer, who have defeated diseases through practicing those ceremonies, and they're very powerful. And we're fortunate that we're able to teach that to our young people. Gender roles and responsibilities is a huge thing. Like I said, we were warrior societies, and then our women had to be industrious in order to survive, because we made our dwellings, our teepees, out of buffalo hides and out of the land. We used every single part of the buffalo, and nothing was like wasted, and there was like no such thing as trash back in the times of our people. And so we were caretakers of Mother Earth. We did a lot to try to make sure that we didn't make too much of an impact on Mother Earth. And like today, there's the Keystone XL pipeline that's coming from all the way down to Texas. They're trying to come through basically Lakota territory, and so the tribes are united in trying to stop that. We do a lot of teaching about Native American parenting, because, like I said, there's a concept that came out of the boarding schools of disciplinary and being strict, you know, there's terminologies within our language that actually speak to, and there's even some people who have written in books that say that, you know, it's odd that all their kids were well behaved, and yet nobody was getting yelled at or hit. You know, the children were very, very. So there was anthropologists that made those statements, and so the term that I was talking about is called wahokunkia, and that basically translates to gently talking to young people, and the term for child is wakanyaja, and that term means that young people are sacred. They're coming from, you know, they're coming to us and they're sacred, and they come from, you know, like the circle of life, and you know how spirituality and a place that where we go and when we pass on, you know, so all the cultural teachings are very significant and important, and that's what we try to do with our young people is teach them about that, because they're coming from homes that there's a lot of drugs and alcohol being used. Maybe there's some domestic violence happening. There you know, high rates of self-harm and suicide. So there's a lack of hope, and I think you know, a lot of that might have to do with just the media and stuff, because you know how much more of the world we can see now from television and the internet and things like that. So a lot of changes have been happening in our community just recently. I mean, I remember when I first started living in Rosebud, there wasn't even TV, and that was in the mid 80s until probably the late 80s when a few channels were on, but not everybody had TVs. And then they came out with those satellite dishes, and you started to see a lot of changes in the community. Young Native children who we work with, they wear baggy pants, and they think that they live out here. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that out here is bad, like stereotypical type of out here, like you know, where gangsters are, or the Crips or the Bloods. And actually, in our communities, there's young people who affiliate themselves with being Crips and Bloods and Serenios and Nortenos, and they don't even have any other ethnic. They've never even left South Central South Dakota. You know, so how is it that they became a Crip or a Blood? How did Crips or Bloods get to our communities? And so it's I think it's part of that is that the lack of culture or the loss of culture, something had to replace it, and so we have a lot of that going on too. We have on average 384 intakes per year. Most of them are males. The average length of stay is 42 days. Our population, average daily population is 15. It used to be 25 when we first started operating, but detention of a juvenile is the last resort. So the first time you get in trouble, you're usually on probation, maybe do a substance abuse assessment. The second time you get in trouble, maybe you'll be on house arrest. The third time that you get in trouble, then the children's court will start looking at, detaining the juvenile until they go to treatment or until a home assessment's done. I think that our numbers really dropped, but I know that our police department has the number of police officers that we had dropped too, and also meth is in our community. There's talk amongst our juveniles that it's available, and we've had young people in our facility who were withdrawing from methamphetamine. So I think that number dropping has a lot to do with those two factors. lack of police and then meth, because a lot of times the juveniles, when they were put in our facility, they would come in because they were intoxicated, so they just were making bad choices, and they'd end up in our facility. The Wble Won Ti, that translates to Eagle Life Center, and that was actually a name that was given to the program by a medicine man. He had come out to the place where they were going to build the facility, and two eagles came in and flew over the area and left. And in our culture, in Native American culture, eagles are revered. They're a significant part of our culture. When somebody accomplishes something, they're given an eagle feather. There's like a lot of recently in like popular culture and things like that, a lot of people are like wearing those eagle feather headdresses, and so it's kind of detrimental to us as Native American people, kind of disrespectful to us as Native American people, because you had to earn that, and chiefs were it took a long life of helping people and doing good things to become a chief. So you couldn't just put one of those on. But I think Victoria's Secret models were wearing them just a few years ago. But the eagles are very sacred to us, and they say when an eagle flies over you, that's a blessing. And unfortunately, those are endangered species. So they're not seen very much, especially in our community. Just some general statistics over the last 4 years. As I was talking about, every year we kind of had around the same amount of intakes, but it just dropped drastically. I think this year we're looking at like around 330. So it's on average just about one juvenile a day. Which isn't too bad, but I mean, we live in a rural community, and like I said, it takes the police officers a long time to get from place to place, because our community is spread out over a large area. Where I live, like I have to drive 30 minutes to get to work every day, and there's just the population density is all spread out. Just some of the crimes that we deal with, as far as the top ones. I mean, a lot of it has to do with this warrant of arrest and contempt of court. When you get in trouble, you're usually given like another court hearing, and we see this in the adult court too. But a lot of people are unable to make it back to court because transportation's an issue out there. Not a lot of people have cars. And people might be just basically rebelling the system, so they don't come back to jail, so they end up getting warrants or contempt of court. But disorderly conduct is one of the common charges. Underage consumption, drug possession, riot, huffing, burglary. This is just kind of the average for every year as far as charges go in our community. We've had some of our young people do some very horrible crimes over the last 5 years. We've had some horrible crimes that have went federal, into the federal system. We've had like some girls, 2 girls killed one girl, and I can't remember the ages, but I think they're all around 15 years old. And the girl that died was stabbed like multiple times. That happened recently, within the last 5 years. We've had, I don't know if you're able to Google rape on the reservation. There's like a 10-minute YouTube video that explains kind of the situation, but we've had some of the young people that we work with unfortunately go on to the federal system. So like I said, they'll go on to the federal system, and they'll end up it's because usually like murder or something very, very criminal, rape, sexual assault, those types of things. So, one of the things that comes out of our facility is, just looking back at our traditions and our culture, and this man right here was a great leader for our people, and this is one of the more famous quotes that he had said. And he was like one of the last ones to not go to the reservation or avoid going to the reservation when he was supposed to. He was kind of rebellious, and he had a lot of people who followed him, but unfortunately he was killed by the tribal police, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs police. But he was part of the leadership that was responsible for the victory over General George Armstrong Custer back in 1876, maybe, somewhere around there. But so the Lakota people have a victory against the United States military. So we celebrate Lakota Victory Day on June 25th, and a lot of the celebratory ceremonies. There's reenactments of that, and what's interesting is that I was talking to one of our juveniles one time in the program, and he had no idea about it. He didn't know anything about our history. He didn't know that we defeated General George Armstrong Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He didn't know any of that. And so that's what we're dealing with there, is just the lack of knowledge of who we are and where we come from and what we're about. And so that's what we try to teach. This is just the tribal flag here for the Rosebud Sioux tribe. Like I said, there's a lot of different communities spread out throughout the county, and there's actually 20 of them. And so that's what that represents. And then it's just, that we're looking out. We're trying to do something positive with locking up young people. It's more of a rehabilitative type approach, but it's much more than that, because it involves, I guess, reversing the years of historical trauma and everything that's affected our community, and try to build on what we know about our culture and how we can bring some of that back to our nations. We keep a pretty busy schedule every day. It's probably fairly consistent with most juvenile detention centers, but we are fortunate enough to have a lot of partnerships with different people in the community to come in and do things for us, and volunteers and things like that. Just so this past summer we brought in a horse program, because our tribe, our nations use the horse to survive, and they were looked at as sacred beings, or the name for horses, Shunka Wakan, and that means sacred dog. But there was a period of time in our history where we didn't even have horses, so they were pretty significant. They allowed us to be more mobile and better able to survive. We have education. On average, our kids are 2.5 years behind in school cumulatively, and on average age of our juveniles is 15. So we got 15-year-olds that are like at a 5th and 6th grade level. We do a lot of cultural programs. We have behavioral management system. We do a lot of gardening. We have beekeeping, counseling, mentoring. We do some assessments. They're evidence-based assessments. We just keep, I guess, building the program and adding more stuff as much as we can to try to help our young people. We get a lot of volunteers. A lot of people from all over the country actually come to our facility and help us oftentimes, and then that's how Tria had come out a few years back, and so we're fortunate to have her. We've done a lot of cultural field trips. Like I said, a lot of our kids didn't even know about Wounded Knee the Wounded Knee Massacre, which happened in 1890. And that's a significant part of our history, and it's only about an hour away from us where that happened. And there were several of our young people that didn't even know about it. So we take them there and spend some time there, and we go to cultural sites in the Black Hills to teach our young people about ceremonial practices that we did in our land, in our homeland, which were important and significant. We do a lot of, we have school, like I said, that's very important. Education. I'll email this to Tria too, and she can get it to you, because I think we're kind of running short on time, and you guys might want to ask some questions. But we do a lot of fitness. We just recently had lacrosse camp. Lacrosse actually is a Native American game that was invented by our people and played throughout the continent. And what's interesting is just in the last 3 years, it's become a part of our community, and we're playing some teams from neighboring cities, like bigger cities that have like lacrosse, annual lacrosse leagues, and our teams, our kids are picking this game up naturally, and they're beating these teams that have been probably playing lacrosse for several years. So. And then, like I said, yoga, our kids really appreciated that, and Tria did a good job doing that, and that really helped a lot of our young people just learn to relax and be fit and things like that. So, the facility was pretty much empty when we built it. We didn't have no funding for books, and then a lot of people came out and did tours, and eventually we had 5,000 books, and we actually had more than we needed. We gave some to the school districts and to kids that would come visit the lobby whenever there's court and stuff like that. So these are just some of the kids that, some of the projects that we've done with the kids that we've done in our program over the past couple of years. Try to get them involved in the community and become a part of fixing the community, empowering them to fix the community and make a difference in changing the community for the better. We do traditional arts and crafts. Young people might learn how to make like our traditional regalia. Like I said, our women were industrious. They had to be, in order for us to survive. They had to know how to make clothing and things out of animal hides and whatever was available to us in the Midwest. This is a picture of our staff. One thing that we've noticed over the past couple of years is we're in a desolate area, and not a lot of people have a lot of resources, and so sometimes it is difficult to get people to our center to teach about the culture, because they might not have transportation, or they might not have gas money, but our staff bring the culture in too. Each one of our staff are Native American. We had a presenter come in one time and teach us. He used to work for the Bureau of Prisons, and he was Native American, and he's a clinical psychologist at the Indian Health Service. And we asked him to come in and teach us about FAS and FAE, because of behavioral issues that young people have that. And so he was talking to us for a few hours about it, and he had said something that really stands out to me today. He said, at no time in history has there ever been this many Native Americans working in corrections. And so that's pretty significant, because just 10, 20, 15 years ago, if you was in jail, you was probably in jail with mostly non-natives as correctional officers. So a lot of the cultural teachings of our staff that they learn from their families, they're able to teach that to our young people too. So our staff they're not just correctional officers, they're looked at as role models, mentors. They listen to the young people, because a lot of our young people deal with some horrible traumas in our community, and I was just astonished. Sometimes, just a lot of bad things happen in our community, and our young people, the ones that end up in juvenile detention, they're there because it's a safe place for them. There's some children who actually prefer not to get out of detention. So it's a good place, and what we're doing there is working for a better future. That's what we're trying to do. And then young man there that is a pretty good artist actually, and so I guess we're at a point now where we're if anybody wants to ask any questions or anything, I'll try to answer them the best I can. Sir.
What's the recidivism?
Recidivism rate is very high, probably 80%. I'd say like over the life of a juvenile, they might return to our program on average 6 times, because usually on the front end the courts are pretty lenient, but towards when they get to be 18, they start to hold them accountable and make them stay longer, for their safety and for the safety of the community. So.
But do you find the severity of the crime maybe reduces over time as well?
The thing that I'm seeing is that a lot of what's happening isn't crime. It's just related to factors of poverty. So victims of poverty, I guess there's some crime, but not very severe. Oftentimes truancy and things that actually aren't criminal. Running away. Or minor in possession of alcohol, those are like considered status offenses, and we really can't legally incarcerate someone for those. But just do a lot of detention time is determined by their factors in their home life, and the support systems that they have in the community. So, any other questions?
You mentioned that they was considering bringing the pipeline through your country.
Yes.
But your tribes are opposed to it?
Yes.
Why is that?
Because if that pipeline, actually there was a story that kind of like a myth that I heard when I was younger, and I didn't really understand it, but I was told that one day the black snake is going to kill everybody, and that pipeline represents that black snake. And if from South Dakota to Texas, there's a huge water reservoir underground. It's you guys would be happy to live there because there's no water here, But we have the benefit of that Wble aquifer, and that helps to irrigate a lot of plants and food in the country. So if that pipeline broke and it contaminated that water system, then it's going to harm not just us but everybody. So thank you for that question. Any other questions? Yes.
If a child is brought in due to behavioral issues, do you normally see a change in their behavior throughout your program?
Yes, we've seen a lot of success with many young people, and what's awesome, the best part of our job is that we see these young people at their worst, but we live in a small community, and so oftentimes we'll run into them, and they might have grown up and have their children of their own, but they'll come up and be quick to tell you how good they're doing. They'll shake your hand and they'll be happy to see you. So we've seen a lot of success and we've seen a lot of change. Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
You talked about like some of the youth like not wanting to like leave even. I'm just like wondering like parent involvement like within the center. Yeah, like how's that like working out?
Yeah, that's been pretty difficult. That's actually part of our mission statement, is to encourage parental involvement and build family ties. But when I was studying for my master's degree, I did a research project and did some evaluations and brought some data together, and I found out that it's just people can't afford to come out and visit. So we're looking to try to increase that, because like we have visitation days and we have call days, but a lot of times parents are when they call, they're intoxicated, or whenever the visitation day comes, only like 20% of the kids get visitors, and that's like once a week. And so it's unfortunate that usually what the factors that contribute to a young people being in detention is it has to do with the parent. And so the courts actually go through a process to try to change the parent too. I mean, that they'll require the parent to do substance abuse assessments. They'll require them to go to treatment. In some cases, I've seen the courts put parents in jail too. And so those are some things that, as a punitive way, that we've used. But it'd be also beneficial if we could try to build those bridges between the parent and the child within the program and with culture. And we've done some of that, but not enough. So yes, that's important.
You spoke a lot about the educational programs that you guys enforce. What do you guys do in terms of preparing or leading these youth to going into higher education outside of the reservation once they have been rehabilitated?
I think on average, our young people, they're about 2.5 years behind in school by the time they get to our program. And so we have a curriculum that helps them to catch up in school and get up to their grade level. But many of our young people have learning disabilities too, which is something that I didn't really know about until I got into this position. So we're working to try to teach like job skills, and that has a lot to do with the gardening and the beekeeping in the community service programs. But we have had a few young people, they had to bring in special teachers from the school district. That we have a good partnership with the school district, but there was a young man who was doing like calculus or something like that, and they had to bring in a special teacher because no one knew anything about calculus. I mean, the teachers that were there anyways. But I don't know, we don't track a lot of students after they're 18. I don't know how many of them have ever went on to college, but I know that in our community we're lucky to have a university there in the community. The Sinte Gleshka University has been a great resource, and they actually have a similar mission statement to ours about bringing the culture back, or preserving it and protecting the culture. So I think a lot of young people who have been in our program might go to that instead of like exterior universities, or universities that are far away from home. So they might not be able to afford it.
So we're at time. If we could just thank Mr. Petite for his really wonderful
Thank you.
Have so much fun. I get nervous. I guess I was scared.